Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Chance Shirley,
I am Chris Vander.
and we are watching George Romero's classic Night of the Living Dead. So, what should we talk about next? I feel like that the first 30 minutes have just flown by.
Yeah, no kidding. I was actually going to ask you, what do you remember what your first encounter with Night of the Living Dead was? Where you saw it, what the impact was for you?
And see, that's the thing. It's one of those movies that just feels like it's all, it's kind of always been with us, and again, because of its ubiquity on, VHS, and late night TV, because as we were talking about earlier, it's public domain status. I'm really struggling to remember where I first saw it. It's probably something like, I remember like the first time I watched Plan 9 from Outer Space. It was when I was growing up. We lived out in rural Alabama, and we didn't have cable, so we only had 3 channels. We had ABC, CBS, and NBC. And when I was a teenager, an upstart independent channel showed up. For anybody in Birmingham, Alabama, it's WTTO Channel 21, and it was so wild because they didn't have any network stuff to show, so they were just showing random stuff. They showed kung fu movies on Saturday afternoons, and science fiction movies Friday nights, and this, that, and the other. I remember seeing some of Plan 9 for the first time on a Friday night, all excited that it was a big sci-fi movie, not understanding the movie's not understanding that movie's cult status was for reasons other than its brilliant screenwriting or whatever.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that would be where that I saw, I feel like the first time I saw it, I never really sat through and just watched it front to back. I felt like it was more of a, catching bits and pieces here and there. It was one of those movies that I kind of assembled from just picking it up, because again, it was just everywhere, so I would just catch little bits of it here and there. Do you remember when you first encountered it?
Yeah, well, I actually I saw Dawn of the Dead before I saw Night of the Living Dead. And I think the reason for that was I was under the mistaken impression that this was, remember how we were talking earlier about how all the other influential horror movies are the Universal films. And I would always remember seeing, because they're public domain, there's a certain list of movies that'll always pop up. It'll be Last Man on Earth, it'll be this film, and then it'll be like White Zombie. And the thing that always sort of blew my mind when I actually looked at the numbers was that this film was years later than all the other ones, but because it was black and white, and because I'd only ever seen a still on the cover, I was making this assumption that it was, from the era of White Zombie and Dracula and all these other things. So I just went and watched Dawn of the Dead because I just assumed, okay, this must be a movie that came out, 40 years later that's sort of about the same thing. And I really liked it. So I was like, okay, I'll go back and watch this old movie. And it turns out it was not that old at all. And it was, not only was it not old age-wise, it was literally as if it had just been branded in time, like up to the second. Even though there's old technology in the TVs and things like that, nothing about this film really feels dated, and it just blew my mind. I just remember the juxtaposition of seeing this in amongst all those other movies that sort of get lumped together, like I said, from the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah, that's another accidental effect of the black and white angle, is it makes it seem more classic than or more than it actually is. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things I like in this movie is that in some ways they use zombies and humans to sort of presage what's going to happen with the other party. Like we had when Ben went outside and he was with the crowbar and he was fighting the zombies outside, she was in there, and then the one stumbled out of that sort of room in the back, and then they had to fight that. And I like how that is in some ways sort of like the precursor. It's sort of foreshadowing to this moment where the same thing is going to happen, but it's with human beings instead of zombies, where we're going to have some door quietly open and some characters be revealed to us. But in this case, they're humans that have been hiding this whole time. So I like the way that this movie sort of toys with that idea of, because you have a monster that looks like a person, you can sort of play both sides of the equation with that. Is this a human being that we're seeing? Is this a monster that we're seeing? And for just a moment, we don't know.
Yeah, which is something that a lot of zombie movies have been able to use, in years since then for good effect. It's oh hey, there's oh shoot, that's not what I thought it was. I thought that was a friend, and when the light got to the right place, I could see that his bottom jaw had rotted off, and now he's going to try to kill me.
Right. And then they sometimes will play it the other way too, where, you thought a monster was at the door, and this is much later when you could get away with it in movies. You shoot, and it turns out that you just killed a friend of yours instead of a zombie.
Yeah, I've played with that in my own zombies movies a couple of times, so that's always a fun trope. Another thing for a smaller movie, and I'm a little out of order because we keep I've done commentaries on my own movies, and it's always fun to get wrapped up in conversation and realize that you haven't actually been talking about what's on the screen. You were talking about what happened 20 minutes ago or whatever. But there's a lot of pyro in this movie. There's a lot of we've seen a few scenes with he was the burning couch, and obviously the fire in this world scares the zombies. And there's a great scene that comes up later in the movie where they try to go get some gas to fill up the truck, I think, and escape, and that all goes south, and that turns into a really amazing set piece. Especially considering that I think the budget on this was, I think I just read the other day, it was like $130,000 or something. Very, very low budget movie to do that kind of pyro action sequence in a movie like this, and I mean with extras on fire and all that kind of stuff, really impressive,
Yeah, for sure. The other thing I think is sort of, it's never really mentioned. It's never said aloud that this is happening, and I don't know that I've ever heard Romero comment on it, but I love the way that we watch the world shrink slowly, the world of these people. So we start with her and her brother, and it's this wide open road, right, driving in from who knows where, but they said they're hours in the car, right? Then they're in this huge open field that is the cemetery in the hills nearby. Then it's the house and the outside area where she runs into Dwayne Jones's character Ben and the gas pumps. Then after that blows up, and then they have to seal themselves into the house. We've gone from the whole country driving down the road to this big wooded area, to the house, to now just down to the basement, to a single room. The way that he just effectively cranks just a little bit smaller a location every few minutes until eventually by the end of the film, there's no place to move, there's no place to go.
That's really great, and I think that as I've talked about a few times, the legacy of this movie, the shadow it cast is so massive. It's easy to get wrapped up, and I'm guilty of this, obviously. It's easy to get wrapped up in that aspect of the movie and sometimes forget that it's just good meat and potatoes filmmaking, It's good screenwriting, it's good acting, it's good cinematography, it's good special effects. Even if this movie was the fifth zombie movie that had been made, even if it wasn't responsible for inventing an entire subgenre, it'd still be a really good movie.
Yeah, and it would probably still be remembered better than the first one because it's such a well-made film.
That's a good point. Even if there had been another Ghoul movie along these lines, this would still probably be the one that we think about because it's unlikely that whoever else had made a Ghoul movie would have done it this well.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think another thing that's interesting we didn't talk much about was, do you remember, and you're probably old enough to remember this, that this was one of the films I feel like that was a big sort of, I don't know what you would call it, like a big arguing point. This, It's a Wonderful Life, and a couple of other ones were touchstones for the fight against colorization. Do you remember that crazy battle?
I remember It's a Wonderful Life being colorized in particular. I had forgotten that this one was in that, but what a terrible movie I love black and white movies, so I wouldn't want to colorize anything, but especially this movie of all movies,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about that a lot, and one of the things I think is like, it's funny because the argument for colorization was, these movies were made before you could put color in it, so we should put color in it because those filmmakers were prevented from being able to do this. And this is a perfect example of like, well, no, yes, it was cheaper for them to get black and white footage, but they could have gotten color footage. They chose black and white. So at this point, you're actually doing a disservice to the artistic vision that filmmaker had.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry I lost you for half a second there because my battery powered earpod died and I had to put the other one in. So yeah, and this gets into another copyright discussion. This movie would be easy to colorize because it was in the public domain. It's a Wonderful Life was actually in the public domain for many years, but they managed to some rights holders managed to take it out of the public domain, which is really weird, to be honest. I forget exactly how they did it. I think it was one of those situations where the movie had entered into the public domain, but some of the source material was still copyrighted, and they were able to use that to go to court and somehow get the rights back. But there was a while when everybody when every TV channel and their brother showed "It's a Wonderful Life" 300 times, around Christmas, and now I think it's on like once a year on NBC or something like that.
Right.
But and I might have missed you there when my earbud went out. Did you say there was another one other than this one in Wonderful Life that everybody was trying to colorize for a while?
Those are the two that I remember, and
Okay,
I
okay.
feel like I remember those two being the ones that were kind of the poster children for the argument. Like those are
Yeah.
the two that everybody was talking about. Well, obviously, we've just met some new characters while we were talking about the colorization. We've met the guys that were downstairs. We met Harry, who I mentioned earlier. That's Carl Hardman, the older guy, the bald guy. He's one of the producers, and then Keith Wayne, the actor, is playing Tom. So, and at this point, we haven't met the other figures, but we now have, I guess you would say, an antagonist presence inside the house, which I feel like is another huge signpost that George Romero created that has become as much part of the iconography of the zombie film as the zombies themselves, which is that there are going to be groups of humans that just fundamentally cannot get along. Existentially, they can't be together, and eventually they're going to tear themselves apart and in some ways be as destructive to each other as the zombies that are outside are.
We have seen the enemy, and he is us.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's a great irony because it's ultimately what it's saying is dead or alive, man is ultimately the worst enemy.
For such a sweet guy, Romero's kind of pessimistic sometimes,
Yeah, and it's you're right though. He's a super nice guy, super sweet guy, but I also think a lot of, especially if you see in his later career, he talked a lot about social issues in his films. Some people would complain at a certain point that he talked so much about social issues that you couldn't just enjoy the narrative. But I like that whether I, agree with his politics or think is this the place to have a conversation about him? I love that it was so important to him, that it was such an integral part of his work that even you look at his first film, he's there's no military presence, but you see the sheriffs and it's clear that he's saying something about the idea of people in power. And he's talking about the inherent divisions in human society. I mean, right from the very start, he was coming out of the gate strong with what he wanted to say with his movies.
And I guess this movie was it 68 when it came out?
Yeah, 1968.
Yeah, so it's 51 years old now, and thinking about the thing with the cops or the sheriffs or whatever they are, we're still dealing with a lot of the same issues today.
Yeah. In fact, there's a fantastic documentary on Shudder called Horror Noir. Which
Oh
is
my gosh,
specifically
dude! It is so
the
good.
It's about the black experience, specifically narrowed into horror film. And I think one of the great things about it is that when you listen to all of the people talk about this film and what it meant to black film goers, to see a strong lead black male in a movie that is not a cliche, that he's not a pushover, but he's also not unnecessarily violent, that he's a wonderfully drawn three-dimensional human being, and it literally was just something they'd never seen in a film before. It's for no other reason than that to watch Horror Noir. It is a spectacular segment where it's really early days for representation starting to happen in film, but it was such a lightning strike,
Yeah, and that whole documentary, as a white guy who has spent his life with too much privilege and not paying attention or understanding what it was like for people of color, all those, and even today, I would argue that people of color are underrepresented in film, but it was obviously worse, like we were saying, in the 60s, it didn't matter how good the actor was, he's probably not going to get the lead in a movie unless maybe he's Sidney Poitier. I'm trying to think if there was anybody else other than him that was really, getting leads like that. And
even then there was that level of respectability politics, right? Which is, if a black man is a lead in a movie, that movie must be a civil rights movie, and it must be a discussion of, some important, you never just had a black guy in a movie who was just a guy in a movie,
Right,
and one of the
right.
refreshing things about Dwayne Jones's character here, Ben, is he's just trying to survive just like everyone else, and he's the decent man, but he's not different in any other way from them. They don't differentiate or separate him, and there's no in some ways, The Walking Dead actually models that a bit. The idea that the characters, it's not that they don't see race, it's that there are far more important things to fight about than things like that. And in that world, there's sort of, I guess you could say, a post-apocalyptic idealism that we've all come together because we have a common enemy that isn't a human, you know?
I think that was Ozymandias' plan in Watchmen.
Exactly, the giant purple octopus.
Right. It's going to bring us all together, you know.
But yeah, so this is one of the other things. I think I don't want to say unfairly because it's certainly there, but I do feel like this movie has been castigated a bit for the character of Barbara, essentially becoming just like a rag doll for the second half of the movie. You know, she's sort of ineffectual, almost nonverbal for a lot of it, and I think some people have seen that as maybe a commentary about gender. But she's not the only female character in it. I mean, obviously, you could argue in the '60s that everybody was further behind in progressiveness in many ways, and so maybe while he was paying attention to having a strong black lead, he wasn't paying attention to the marginalization of the female characters. But I've never felt like it felt like a commentary on women so much as it felt like that could have been anyone. Mm-hmm. Like I see myself in Barbara's character actually more than anyone here, because I've had trauma happen in my life, not to a great degree, but when it does, I recognize the instinct to shut down a bit, to sort of pull back from reality to a degree.
Absolutely.
And for me, it's the most relatable character in this movie. So when I hear people say that they have a problem with the way that the woman is portrayed, I understand because it's been assigned a female character. But if that had been a guy, I would have felt no differently. I still think that would have been the character I connected to the most.
Yeah, and you know, we could probably do a whole long discussion on gender politics and race politics in the '60s. I'm a big fan of Star Trek, the original show from the '60s with Shatner and Leonard Nimoy and everybody, and that show is rightfully respected as a very progressive show. You know, there was a black woman lead, there was an Asian guy that was a lead. The show featured the first interracial kiss between a white man and a black woman. So and a lot of the subtext on the show would often be about, there were anti-war episodes, there were anti-racism episodes. The show was legitimately progressive, but when I watch the show now, as much as I love it, the casual sexism and misogyny on that show really bums me out, because the way that they treat the women characters is so obviously dismissive. So often it's like, are you freaking kidding me? It's like you guys were. It was the late '60s. You guys were smart enough to realize that racism was bad. These sexist tropes, were just. Oh my gosh, it's like, if Captain Kirk acted that way in the workplace, he would be fired in a heartbeat. And it's not just Captain Kirk, a lot of the male characters, are just, like I said, incredibly dismissive toward the female characters for no good reason. And
right.
And it's one day, I've always got, a billion, projects on the back burner, but because I know everybody really needs another middle-aged, dude to sit down and explain to you, what works and what doesn't work in every episode of the old Star Trek show. I'm gonna do that as a blog series or something, because it really is. As I get older, it's Star Trek is, as much as a lot of people would say this, it really is one of the touchstones for me. When I was growing up in the early '70s, mid '70s. This was before Star Wars. We didn't, and even after Star Wars, we didn't have like Netflix with a new science fiction show coming on every week. So pretty much all we had was like old Twilight Zone reruns and Star Trek reruns. So it's a really important show to me. It means a lot to me, for a lot of reasons. But yeah, the gender politics on that show are surprisingly archaic.
Yeah. So we should note before the scene ends, this is actually the first sequence we've had where none of our main characters was in it. We only met him 5 minutes ago. He went into the basement, and we've had a really extended scene exploring this family. The two new characters, by the way, being the family, right? We've got Marilyn Eastman here as Helen Cooper, and then the daughter, played by Kyra Sean, I think is her name, playing Karen. And yeah, and it's the first introduction of what's ultimately going to be one of the most important locations of the film, that basement.
Yeah, and it's been a while since I've revisited this. Is the daughter, is she out of it the whole time, or is there any point where she's lucid?
You know what? I feel like there must not be, because if neither of us can remember it, it probably isn't.
It seems like, and obviously spoilers, you know, it seems like she's pretty much out of the bag until the big, you know, well, I guess one of the big twists, you know, where
Yeah,
where she's both more mobile and less healthy than we thought.
Yeah, exactly. She only gets ambulatory when it's time to eat, Mom. Yeah, I love, like I said, you know how there's they establish the space is getting smaller and smaller, but they do it in small increments. You know, when they first go into the house, the doors are still open. Ben still goes outside. They're going to go out to the gas pump. So the first time they come into the basement, we see the hallway leading up and see this open door here in the space, and it's very cleverly designed to make it feel like these characters have choices, and then the movie just slowly picks their choices off one at a time. You know, like. I love you not, flower petals getting picked off, you know, until eventually there is no choice but to go to the one place that Ben didn't want to go. And I really love, ultimately, the other thing that I think is great is Harry is pretty much a bastard. You know, he's confrontational. He gets in Ben's face and he gets put down for it. But ultimately, as much as we hate him, and we should because his behavior is terrible, Harry was right. He wanted to go in the basement. And the basement was the only safe place, as it turned out.
Ah, man, I hate it when the bastards are right.
Right? And to think about it, like, how much easier would it have been to convince everybody to go down there if you weren't a bastard? Maybe that's the life lesson here.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Because whenever people are abrasive like that. Even when they make a good point, nobody wants to give them credit for it, you know, because, I mean, they're so difficult.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like a simple thing, but I think it's very possible that that's what George Romero might be commenting on, which is, I'm not disagreeing with your idea, I'm disagreeing with you. This is, you can tell this is a movie from 1968 because everyone is constantly lighting cigarettes.
Well, you know, in fairness, it's the end of the world. Smoke them if you got them. I mean,
that's a fair point. Yeah. I also love that his tie clip is literally an inch above his belt. That is how high his pants are. Look at that. That is way up there.
Oh yeah. You know, it's funny. I'm a big fan of, as a lot of people are, of Jurassic Park. And as much as I love that movie, you know, that's an early '90s movie. And the thing that always gets me about that movie, and I don't know why I obsess about this, but Laura Dern, you know, she's always wearing those little like safari shorts. Mm-hmm. And the waistline, I swear, on those safari shorts, because it was the '90s or the early '90s, they're up around her belly button. It's just like the waist is so ridiculously high. And so my wife and I are, you know, we're old people, so we'll be out and we see all the youngsters, and all the youngsters these days are wearing the high-waisted jeans like in the '90s, you know, and I just can't get, I'm like, why would anybody want to do that? I mean, I know that I'm old, but that was a bad idea when we did it in the '90s. Laura Dern, who's absolutely adorable, not her best look, you know?
Right. Well, I mean, it's all cyclical, right? I mean, that's how it happens. All the movies in the 80s were about 50s adventures, and now all the movies now are about television shows from the 80s.
It is very cyclical. And my wife says that I'm just an old idiot, and she thinks that those young girls look, you know, cute with the high-waisted jeans. So A, what do I know? And B, I was just noticing today before we started recording, I was watching a little bit of ESPN. Do you remember in the 80s, and I've had this on my mind because of Stacy and I saw a punk rock like art exhibit, and it was not really punk rock art, it was like punk rock marketing materials and album covers and flyers and stuff like that, you know. We saw that the last time we were up in New York. It was really great. But one of the things, do you remember in the 80s, of course you remember the bright neon colors.
Right.
Do you remember the geometry? Like there were a lot of like random like triangles and squares and circles drawn on stuff.
I do. I absolutely do.
So I'm assuming that you're probably like me and not a huge sports nerd, but like next Saturday, whenever like game day is on or whatever, watch the package graphics that ESPN is doing. Dude, I swear to you, the 80s are coming back. the shapes are coming into place in like weird little geometric patterns. And you remember everything looked like splashed paint, like somebody had just splashed some paint on something for no good reason.
Yep.
They're doing that in like an animation thing. Like there's these like it'll say like SEC and there's these like bright ESPN things, and there's like I had been thinking we were about due for that style of 80s art design, I guess, production design to come back, and I feel like it's there.
Yeah, everything looks like a logo for a Nickelodeon game show.
And they just threw slime all over it. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, it's just everything is definitely cyclical, and so now we've got the '60s high-waisted pants back, at least for the women, and the '80s vibrant colors and random geometry seems to be coming back. So whenever somebody's listening to this episode 10 years from now, they'll know where fashion and design were headed in 2019.
That's hilarious. So this is one of my favorite sort of things that I love in this movie that I wish other movies hadn't taken on, which is the massive exposition dump.
Right.
That everyone gathers around the information box and we all learn what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
I love the way it's executed here, and it's super smart filmmaking from an independent perspective. But I do feel like this has kind of jinxed us to every story that has some sort of like worldwide catastrophe. There is this moment in them now.
Yeah. I was talking with a friend the other day. He had mentioned we were on Twitter, and he had mentioned a movie that he remembered that he was rewatching. It was a movie from when he was a kid, and he hadn't watched it in a long time, and he was rewatching it, and he was shocked at the lack of exposition. Apparently, it was one of those movies where they just kind of throw you in, and you either sink or swim as far as understanding the story.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to say that's George Romero there with the microphone. He's one of the reporters.
With the hat on, or the other guy?
Yeah, the one on the left, I believe, is George Romero. He was a big guy, so I'm assuming the tallest one there on the left with the microphone.
See, I always saw him when he was older, and he always seemed kind of small, but I guess he was just a little more hunched over at that point.
Could be. Sorry. Anyway.
No. Yeah. But I was saying that exposition is boring, and nobody wants exposition anyways. But yeah, I think so. That's a good point. Now that we're talking about it, with all the other kind of innovations that this movie did, I wonder if the extended news segment was part of it.
Well, I feel like this is George Romero's way of replacing what was already a cliche at this time, which is the know-it-all scientist, right? Like the guy that has to explain it.
Oh,
yeah. Because there would be a guy that would walk in, and it's like that. One of my favorite movies ever is Matinee, and there's a movie in a movie called Mant, half man, half ant, all terror.
I saw Matinee for the first time a couple of years ago, actually on 35 in New York at a theater up there, at a repertory theater, and it's such a wonderful film. And
it catches that tone perfectly.
As a fan of, it's recommended for anybody who's a fan of those 50s science fiction movies. Hey, tell you what, I think this is probably a good place to take a little break now that the exposition dump is winding down. So we'll go to commercial, and we'll be back with the rousing finale of George Romero's Night of the Living Dead.